The bright morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Courtroom 7A at the Franklin County Courthouse, casting sharp rays across the room and illuminating the dark wood of the furniture. Judge William Harrison, a 58-year-old white man with graying temples and wire-rimmed glasses, sat perfectly straight in his high-backed leather chair. His reputation for punctuality, order, and strict courtroom management was well known throughout the legal community. He ran his courtroom with a no-nonsense attitude, and his decisions were often respected, even feared, by attorneys and litigants alike. As always, his presence commanded respect, and every movement he made was deliberate and precise. At exactly 8:55 a.m., Judge Harrison adjusted the folds of his black robes, ran a hand through his thinning hair, and nodded to his clerk, Sarah, signaling that it was time to begin preparing for the day's proceedings. The large wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open, and one by one, people filed in for the 9 a.m. session. Lawyers in crisp suits walked briskly to their seats, briefcases in hand, while court reporters and assistants hurried to their designated spots, shuffling through papers and making last-minute adjustments to their equipment. Judge Harrison observed them all with his usual stern expression, checking his watch every few minutes, ensuring that everything was running on time. His sharp eyes flicked from person to person, his mind already focused on the day's schedule. He hated delays of any kind, whether it was the tardiness of a lawyer, a late-arriving witness, or an absent defendant, and today was particularly important. A high-profile medical malpractice case was set to begin, and the jury had been carefully selected over the past week. This trial would be one of the major cases of the year, and Judge Harrison was determined to keep everything running smoothly. At precisely 9 a.m., the sound of his gavel striking the sound block echoed through the room like a gunshot. "Court is now in session," he announced in his deep, authoritative voice. The bustling courtroom fell into an instant silence, as the members of the jury took their seats, the attorneys adjusted their papers, and everyone knew that the time for delays had passed. It was time for business. But as Judge Harrison began his opening remarks, something unexpected happened. The heavy courtroom doors, which had been closed moments before, suddenly creaked open again. This time, a black woman in her early 40s hurried in. She tried to move as quietly as possible, but her high-heeled shoes clicked sharply against the marble floor, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Her navy blue suit was neatly tailored, and she carried a leather messenger bag in her left hand, but the small droplets of sweat on her forehead and the quick, uneven steps she took suggested that she had just arrived from somewhere else, likely in a hurry. Judge Harrison's face darkened immediately, his jaw tightening as he scowled in her direction. He despised tardiness more than anything else in his courtroom. To him, it was a sign of disrespect for the institution of law, and he made no secret of his disdain for it. Without hesitation, he struck his gavel again, the sharp sound ringing out through the silent room. "Ma'am," he called out sternly, his voice commanding, "approach the bench immediately." The woman froze in her tracks. Her eyes flickered briefly to the judge before meeting the eyes of the people around her. Her face registered a flash of surprise, and she paused before walking toward the front of the courtroom. Despite her clear discomfort at being the center of attention, she held her head high and moved forward with confidence. As she reached the front of the courtroom, Judge Harrison's glare never wavered. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" he asked, his voice dripping with disapproval. He didn't wait for her to answer. "This is a court of law, not a coffee shop, where you can stroll in whenever you please." His words hung in the air, the weight of his judgment felt by everyone in the room. The woman, clearly flustered, opened her mouth to speak, but Judge Harrison cut her off before she could utter a word. "Your disrespect for this court and everyone present here is unacceptable," he said firmly. "What's your name?" "Dr. Michelle Thompson," she replied calmly, despite the growing frustration in her eyes. "Well, Dr. Thompson," Judge Harrison said, emphasizing her title with a hint of sarcasm, "being a doctor doesn't exempt you from following basic courtroom protocol. This isn't a hospital where you can make your own schedule." There was a tense stillness in the courtroom as the judge's words reverberated around the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their unease palpable. It was clear that the judge's tone had caught the attention of not only Dr. Thompson but everyone present. The tension in the air grew thicker by the second as they watched the scene unfold. Dr. Thompson stood there, her posture straight and her expression composed, even though her insides were no doubt churning. She had been forced to walk into a room already full of judgment. She had endured enough to last a lifetime in this moment. But her dignity remained intact. "Your Honor, if I could just explain," she began, but again Judge Harrison interrupted her, his tone growing more impatient. "I've heard every excuse in the book over my 25 years on this bench," he declared, cutting her off completely. "I'm finding you $500 for contempt of court. Perhaps that will teach you the importance of punctuality and respect for our legal system." The words stung. Dr. Thompson's face remained serene, but her hands gripped the leather strap of her messenger bag just a little tighter. Every muscle in her body was likely screaming, but she didn't let it show. The courtroom was completely silent, save for the steady ticking of an old clock on the wall. Everyone was waiting, their collective breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. Then, something unexpected happened. Sarah, the court clerk, jumped up from her seat. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she rushed to the judge's bench. She leaned in close to Judge Harrison's ear, whispering urgently, her voice barely audible to the crowd. The change in Judge Harrison's expression was immediate and dramatic. The color drained from his face, and his usual stern demeanor cracked. His eyes widened behind his glasses and his mouth opened slightly in shock. "Dr. Michelle Thompson isn't just anyone," Sarah whispered. "She's the forewoman for today's jury. She's the highly respected neurosurgeon we selected because of her expertise and judgment." Judge Harrison blinked, his mind reeling as Sarah continued speaking softly in his ear. "Dr. Thompson was delayed because she was performing emergency CPR on an elderly man who collapsed on the courthouse steps. The paramedics just arrived to take him to the hospital." For a long moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, the weight of the situation settling in like a heavy fog. Judge Harrison's face turned from pale to a deep shade of red as he absorbed the full extent of his mistake. His gaze fell on Dr. Thompson again, and this time, he noticed the disarray of her otherwise immaculate appearance. The scuff marks on her knees from kneeling on concrete, the slight wrinkle in her jacket from the rush, and the faint traces of medical powder on her hands, remnants of the emergency gloves she must have used. Several jurors, who had been seated quietly, began whispering among themselves. They had spent the last week getting to know Dr. Thompson during jury selection and were well aware of her impressive background as a neurosurgeon. Some shook their heads in disapproval at the judge's hasty actions, clearly uncomfortable with the way he had handled the situation. Dr. Thompson stood there, patiently enduring the uncomfortable silence, her dignity still intact. Despite the humiliation of the moment, she remained calm. She had endured far worse in her career, and this was just another moment she would rise above. As she reached into her bag to retrieve something, her composure was undisturbed. Sarah, watching from the sidelines, felt a pang of sympathy for the woman who had been unjustly chastised. But she knew that in this courtroom, justice would prevail. The judge had made his mistake, but now it was time to correct it. She could only hope that the truth would soon be revealed, not just in this courtroom, but to everyone who had witnessed this scene unfold. Judge Harrison's actions would serve as a reminder that assumptions and biases, however ingrained, could have consequences, and that those in power must always remain vigilant against their own judgments. Expanded rewrite **. Dr. Michelle Thompson calmly pulled out her phone and held it up for Sarah, the court clerk, to see. Her phone screen displayed 3 missed calls from emergency services, confirming her story, and a text message from the paramedics thanking her for her quick action in saving the elderly man's life. As Sarah read the messages, she recognized the gravity of the situation. She quickly relayed this information to Judge Harrison, who stared at the screen for a few moments, his face drained of color. Judge Harrison cleared his throat several times, trying to regain his composure. His usual confident demeanor, which had always been a hallmark of his reputation, was visibly shaken. The room fell silent again, the tension palpable as the judge struggled to find his voice. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke, his tone completely different from the stern reprimand he had delivered just moments before. "Dr. Thompson," he began, his voice now softer, laced with a hint of embarrassment, "I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding." "Yes, Your Honor, there has been," Dr. Thompson replied calmly, her voice steady, professional, and composed. But her eyes, which had remained steady under the scrutiny of the judge in the courtroom, now held a challenge that made Judge Harrison shift uncomfortably in his seat. There was no malice in her gaze, only a quiet strength and an implicit demand for respect. "Would you like me to explain why I was delayed?" Dr. Thompson continued. "Or would you prefer to make more assumptions about my character and profession?" Her words were delivered with a calmness that contrasted starkly with the fire that flickered beneath them. A few gasps echoed through the courtroom at Dr. Thompson's bold response. It was rare for anyone, let alone a witness or juror, to speak to Judge Harrison in such a manner, especially in the middle of a tense moment like this. The defense attorney, James Martinez, quickly hid a smile behind his hand, while the prosecuting attorney nervously glanced between Judge Harrison and the jury box, unsure of how the judge would react. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of the moment. Judge Harrison's clerk, Sarah, hurriedly brought him a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. He gulped it down in a single swallow, trying to calm the nerves that were suddenly threatening to overtake him. Then, after a brief pause, he spoke again, his voice a bit more measured this time. "The court," he began but hesitated. He took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief, as if trying to regain his clarity. "The court withdraws the contempt charge and the fine, Dr. Thompson. Please accept my sincere apologies for my hasty judgment." The apology, though genuine, felt a little awkward in the moment. Dr. Thompson stood still, her posture unflinching. There was no dramatic display of emotion, just an unspoken understanding that this apology, while appreciated, did not erase the events of the past few minutes. But Dr. Thompson wasn't finished. With the same calm professionalism she had displayed in her operating room, she addressed the judge directly, her words cutting through the tension that still hung in the air. "Your Honor," she began, her tone measured but firm, "while I accept your apology, I feel compelled to point out that your initial reaction reveals a troubling pattern." She paused, letting her words land before continuing. "When you saw me enter this courtroom, you made immediate assumptions about who I was and why I was here. You didn't ask for an explanation. You didn't consider that I might have a valid reason for being late. You didn't even verify my role in today's proceedings before judging me." The courtroom was still. Even the faint rustling of paper or the occasional cough was absent, as every person present realized that this was no ordinary moment. Every word Dr. Thompson spoke was being recorded, captured for posterity. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph, capturing every word of the exchange, every nuance of the conversation. Judge Harrison's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his mistake visible in the way he carried himself. It was clear that the events of the morning had affected him more deeply than he had anticipated. The remorse was unmistakable. He wasn't used to being challenged in such a direct and eloquent manner. But Dr. Thompson's words, though measured, had hit their mark. He knew that he had failed in his duty to treat everyone in his courtroom with fairness and respect. "You are absolutely correct, Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with a self-awareness he rarely allowed to show. "My behavior was inappropriate and unprofessional. I failed to uphold the very standards of justice and fairness that this court represents." Dr. Thompson nodded once, acknowledging the judge's admission of guilt. There was no smugness in her demeanor, no desire to make him feel smaller for his mistake. She simply spoke the truth, and now that it had been acknowledged, she offered no further comment. Her response was dignified, like a surgeon moving on to the next task without hesitation. "Then perhaps, Your Honor," Dr. Thompson continued, her voice still calm but now carrying a note of finality, "we can proceed with today's case. I believe we have important matters to address, and I know everyone's time is valuable." Judge Harrison nodded, visibly relieved to return to more familiar territory. "Yes, of course. Please take your seat with the jury, Dr. Thompson," he said, his voice now more steady. "And again, my sincere apologies for the delay and my misconduct." As Dr. Thompson walked to the jury box, her fellow jurors made space for her without hesitation. The respect in their gestures was palpable. Dr. Thompson's professionalism, her composure in the face of such an unfair situation, had not gone unnoticed. A young law student sitting in the gallery, witnessing the entire exchange, quickly wiped away a tear, deeply moved by the dignity with which Dr. Thompson had handled the situation. It was a moment that would stick with him for a long time. Judge Harrison watched Dr. Thompson take her seat, his usual confidence shaken to its core. In just 15 minutes, his entire worldview had been called into question, and he knew that this morning would change how he approached his duties from this day forward. The thought of how many other times his snap judgments might have affected the course of justice in his courtroom lingered in his mind as he prepared to begin the day's proceedings. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had failed not only Dr. Thompson, but everyone who had ever stood in front of him expecting fairness and impartiality. During the morning recess, the courthouse buzzed with whispers about the dramatic events that had unfolded in courtroom 7A. People gathered around coffee machines and in hallway corners, sharing the details of the morning's events, wondering how such a mistake could have happened in a courtroom as prestigious as Judge Harrison's. Sarah, the court clerk, found herself caught up in the gossip. She spoke with her colleague, Jenny, about what she had learned during jury selection. "Dr. Thompson isn't just any doctor," Sarah explained, stirring her coffee. She's one of the top neurosurgeons at Memorial Hospital. Did you know she was the first black woman to head the surgery department there? Meanwhile, in the jury room, Dr. Thompson sat quietly, reviewing her notes for the medical malpractice case. Her fellow jurors, many of whom had witnessed her handling of the morning's incident with grace and professionalism, treated her with a mixture of respect and awe. One juror, Mark Peterson, a high school teacher, finally worked up the courage to ask her about the emergency outside the courthouse. "The elderly man is stable now," Dr. Thompson explained, her voice warm but professional. "His grandson called to thank me. Apparently, Mr. Chen had forgotten to take his heart medication this morning." She didn't mention that she had already arranged with the hospital to check on Mr. Chen during her lunch break, as it wasn't relevant to the proceedings. It was simply part of who she was. Someone who took responsibility not just for her patients but for the well-being of others in any circumstance. In Judge Harrison's private chambers, a difficult conversation was unfolding between the younger judge and his longtime friend and mentor, retired Judge Robert Maxwell. The older judge had heard about the morning's events and came to offer his perspective. "Well, Bill," Judge Maxwell said, using the younger judge's first name as a sign of their long friendship, "I've known you for 20 years. You've always prided yourself on being fair and impartial. What happened this morning?" Judge Harrison stared out his office window, watching the flow of people moving in and out of the courthouse. "I made a terrible mistake, Bob," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "When I saw her rushing in late, I made assumptions. Assumptions I had no right to make." Judge Maxwell, ever the educator, responded by pulling out a folder he had brought with him. "Do you know why Dr. Thompson was selected as the jury forewoman?" he asked, opening the folder to reveal newspaper clippings and medical journal articles. As Judge Harrison flipped through the materials, his face registered increasing dismay. Dr. Michelle Thompson had published groundbreaking research on traumatic brain injuries. She had established a free medical clinic in an underserved neighborhood and regularly volunteered to train emergency medical technicians in advanced life-saving techniques. It became clear to Judge Harrison that Dr. Thompson's quick action in helping Mr. Chen that morning wasn't just a random act of kindness, it was a testament to her expertise and commitment to the medical field. "She serves on 3 different medical review boards," Judge Maxwell continued. "Her expertise is exactly why both legal teams agreed to have her on this malpractice case jury. She's known for her careful attention to detail and absolute fairness in evaluating medical procedures." Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, stunned. The weight of his earlier actions pressed down on him as he realized just how badly he had misjudged Dr. Thompson. The morning's events had been more than just a courtroom mishap. They were a stark reminder of the dangers of bias and the importance of truly understanding those who stand before you, especially when their expertise could change the course of a trial. In the courthouse cafeteria, 2 young law interns chatted over their sandwiches, discussing the morning's events. "My professor would have loved to see this one intern remarked. "It's like a real-life lesson in implicit bias and judicial conduct." The other intern nodded in agreement, knowing that they had witnessed something truly important in the courtroom that day. A lesson that, for Judge Harrison, would stay with him forever. Expanded rewrite asterisk. Dr. Michelle Thompson handled the situation with such poise that it left a lasting impression on everyone in the courtroom. No shouting, no drama, just a calm and collected display of professionalism that commanded respect. It was a reminder that true power lies not in emotional outbursts, but in the strength to maintain composure and stay focused on what really matters. As she returned to the jury room after the morning's intense exchange, Dr. Thompson received an update on Mr. Chen's condition. She read the text message from the paramedics, her mind immediately retracing the events of that morning. She had been running early for court, eager to arrive ahead of time, but when she saw the elderly man collapse, there had been no hesitation. Instinctively, without even thinking twice, she had rushed to his side. It was just who she was, both as a doctor and as a human being. Her decision to stop and assist him hadn't been motivated by any desire for recognition, but simply by the knowledge that she could help. She performed CPR, directed bystanders to call for emergency services, and stayed with Mr. Chen until the paramedics arrived to take over. In that moment, she hadn't seen a courtroom or a jury to attend to, just a man in need of life-saving care. Her thoughts were abruptly interrupted when a court officer entered the room, carrying lunch orders. As Dr. Thompson accepted her salad, she noticed a small handwritten note attached to the container. The note was from the courthouse security team, thanking her for her swift and decisive action earlier that day. The team had reviewed the security footage and seen how she had run to Mr. Chen's aid without hesitation, taking charge of the situation and providing life-saving measures until the paramedics arrived. Dr. Thompson felt a quiet sense of fulfillment as she read the note, though she didn't let it distract her from the task at hand. Before she could finish reading, one of her fellow jurors, an elderly woman named Martha, gently touched her arm. "My husband had a heart attack last year," Martha said softly. "Someone like you saved his life by doing CPR." Her eyes were filled with gratitude as she spoke. "I hope Judge Harrison realizes what kind of person he tried to find fault with today." Dr. Thompson smiled kindly at Martha, her expression warm yet composed. She didn't need to respond with words, the sincerity of her smile was enough. She acknowledged Martha's words, but remained focused on the reason she was in the courthouse, to fulfill her duty as the jury forewoman. Despite the morning's discomfort, Dr. Thompson had come to the realization that her responsibility was far greater than any personal insult she may have faced. The malpractice case they were about to hear was complex, and her medical expertise would be crucial in ensuring a fair and just verdict. She had a duty to stay objective and professional, no matter the challenges she encountered. The lunch break was drawing to a close, and Dr. Thompson knew that it was time to return to the courtroom. Though she had already endured an uncomfortable morning, she was determined to remain focused and to carry out her role as forewoman with the same professionalism and dedication she brought to her work as a doctor. She was prepared to face the afternoon session with the same level of composure, despite the previous events. However, little did she know that her interactions with Judge Harrison were far from over. In his chambers, Judge William Harrison felt an unusual sense of nervousness. For the first time in his 25-year career, he had asked his clerk, Sarah, to delay the start of court by 15 minutes. He wasn't usually a man who doubted himself, but this morning had changed something inside him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had misjudged Dr. Michelle Thompson, and he needed to make it right. At precisely 1:45 p.m. he walked toward the jury room, where Dr. Thompson was reviewing case notes. As he entered, the other jurors quickly stood up out of respect, but Judge Harrison's eyes were fixed firmly on Dr. Thompson. "Dr. Thompson, may I speak with you privately for a moment?" he asked, his voice noticeably less confident than usual. Dr. Thompson looked up from her papers, her expression neutral. She had already made peace with the situation, but she knew that this conversation would be important for both her and the judge. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, standing and following him to a small conference room nearby. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment, there was silence between them, heavy with unspoken words. Judge Harrison gestured for Dr. Thompson to take a seat, but she declined, preferring to stand. The judge seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of his own thoughts. He was about to admit to something he hadn't expected to face, a mistake in judgment not just about Dr. Thompson's character, but about his own biases. "Dr. Thompson," he began, his voice lacking its usual authority, "I owe you more than the brief apology I gave this morning." Dr. Thompson's gaze remained steady as she listened. The judge continued, his words coming with greater humility than she had expected. "I spent my lunch break reading about your work," he said, his voice softening. "Your contributions to medical science, your free clinic, your teaching at the medical school. I was ashamed to learn that just last month, you received the city's humanitarian award for your work with underprivileged communities." Dr. Thompson listened without interruption, her hands clasped in front of her as she considered his words carefully. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke. "Your Honor, I don't need you to list my accomplishments. What I needed this morning was basic respect. The same respect you would give any person walking into your courtroom." Her words landed, and Judge Harrison's shoulders slumped slightly as he absorbed her point. He had been wrong. When he had first seen Dr. Thompson walk into the courtroom, he had made assumptions based on his own biases. He hadn't seen a distinguished neurosurgeon or a leader in her community. He had seen a black woman and assumed she didn't belong. "You're absolutely right," he admitted, his voice tinged with regret. "When you walked in, I saw what I expected to see, what my biases told me to see. I didn't see Dr. Michelle Thompson, a distinguished neurosurgeon and community leader. I didn't even see a potential juror. I saw you as a black woman who I assumed didn't belong in my courtroom." Dr. Thompson didn't raise her voice, but her words carried the weight of countless similar experiences. "Exactly," she replied, finishing his sentence. "And that's something I face every day. But I don't let it make me angry. I just keep proving people wrong." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, acknowledging the depth of her statement. He had failed to see the full picture of Dr. Thompson, her accomplishments, her integrity, her professionalism, and instead had let his prejudices cloud his judgment. Dr. Thompson's calmness in confronting this reality made him realize just how much he still had to learn. As the silence lingered between them, Dr. Thompson turned her gaze toward the window, looking out at the city below. "You know, Your Honor," she began, "every day I walk into my hospital, I still get people assuming I'm a nurse or an aide. Just last week, a patient's family demanded to see the real doctor. And I was standing there in my surgical scrubs with my name and title clearly displayed." Judge Harrison listened intently, the realization of the daily battles Dr. Thompson faced settling in his mind. It wasn't just a matter of one mistake in the courtroom, it was part of a larger, systemic issue that she had been navigating her entire life. "I don't have the luxury of letting those assumptions make me angry," Dr. Thompson continued, her voice steady. "When I'm holding someone's life in my hands during surgery, I have to stay focused. When I'm evaluating a medical malpractice case as a jury forewoman, I need to stay objective." The judge stood beside her at the window, his expression contemplative. "How do you do it? How do you maintain such professionalism in the face of this?" he asked, genuinely curious. Dr. Thompson turned to face him, her voice strong yet kind. "Because every time I prove someone's assumptions wrong, I make it a little easier for the next person who looks like me. Every time I excel despite the prejudice, I create a crack in someone's biased worldview." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully as if seeing the world in a new light. "Like you did with me this morning," he said softly. "Exactly," Dr. Thompson replied, her voice calm but resolute. "Now, Your Honor, we have a medical malpractice case waiting. Shall we return to the courtroom and proceed with the real reason we're both here today?" As they walked back to the courtroom together, Judge Harrison realized that this conversation had changed him more than any judicial training session ever could. When they returned to the courtroom, Dr. Thompson took her seat in the jury box with the same dignity and composure she had shown all day. The afternoon session was about to begin, but there was a different energy in the room now. The gavel fell, but it sounded softer, more deliberate. When Judge Harrison called the court to session, his voice carried a new note of humility, one that his regular courtroom visitors had never heard before. The medical malpractice trial moved forward, and as the case unfolded, it became clear why Dr. Michelle Thompson had been chosen as jury forewoman. Her calm professionalism, her expertise, and her unwavering sense of fairness were essential in ensuring that the case was handled with the seriousness it deserved. For Judge Harrison, the morning's misstep had led to a profound personal transformation. He would never look at his role in the courtroom, or the people who entered it, quite the same way again. Expanded rewrite asterisk. Dr. Michelle Thompson's presence in the courtroom during the afternoon session was impossible to ignore, but not for the reasons one might have expected after the earlier incident. As the medical experts took the stand, Dr. Thompson's careful attention to detail became immediately obvious to everyone present. She sat upright in her chair, her back straight and her posture impeccable, signaling both her focus and her professionalism. Her eyes never strayed from the witness on the stand as she took meticulous notes in a small leather-bound notebook, each word she wrote reflecting the depth of her understanding. To any trained observer, it was clear that Dr. Thompson was not just another juror, she was an expert in the medical field whose presence added invaluable insight to the trial. When the jury was allowed to submit questions for the witnesses, Dr. Thompson's questions were always precise, thoughtful, and pertinent. It was evident that she was not just passively absorbing information but actively engaging with the testimony. The case they were hearing involved a young mother who had suffered severe complications during a routine surgery. Dr. James Miller, the defendant's surgeon, was on the witness stand at that moment, explaining his actions during the procedure. His demeanor was confident at first, but Dr. Thompson's attentive gaze seemed to rattle him. Every time he glanced in her direction, his confidence seemed to falter, as though he knew that her expertise might expose any attempt to downplay his decisions or obscure the truth. The defense attorney, attempting to maintain control of the testimony, asked Dr. Miller to explain his choice of surgical approach. The surgeon began to give a detailed medical explanation, one that seemed to stretch the limits of what the average person could understand. Judge Harrison, who had been keenly observing Dr. Thompson throughout the trial, noticed something interesting. As Dr. Miller spoke, Dr. Thompson's hand moved swiftly, her pen flying across the pages of her notebook. She was catching details that others might have missed, things that only someone with her medical background could truly appreciate. Several times throughout the explanation, Dr. Thompson's expression shifted subtly. When Dr. Miller used technical terms, her brow furrowed, and her eyes sharpened with concentration. There was one particular moment when, during an especially complex and convoluted explanation, Dr. Harrison saw Dr. Thompson shake her head slightly. It was such a small gesture, but it was significant. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a momentary lapse of attention, but to Judge Harrison, it spoke volumes. The judge couldn't help but wonder what Dr. Thompson had caught that he or anyone else might have missed. Her expertise was clearly a game-changer in this trial. The other jurors, noticing Dr. Thompson's focused and engaged demeanor, often turned to her for subtle cues when medical terminology became too confusing. In a quiet and discreet manner, Dr. Thompson would occasionally write simple explanations in her notebook and pass them to her fellow jurors, helping them grasp the complexities of the medical testimony they were hearing. She did this with a level of care that ensured she was not swaying anyone's opinion or influencing the verdict. Instead, her notes served to clarify the technical aspects of the case, allowing her fellow jurors to follow the discussion with greater understanding. She was not trying to lead the jury to any particular conclusion but simply to ensure that the facts were clear, so the decision-making process could be based on accurate information. During the afternoon break, Sarah, the court clerk, overheard two lawyers discussing the trial in the hallway. Their conversation centered around Dr. Thompson's role on the jury. Having Dr. Thompson on that jury is like having a human lie detector for medical testimony, one lawyer whispered. Did you see how the defendant started sweating when she raised her eyebrow during his explanation of the surgical complications? The other lawyer nodded knowingly. I heard she's written 3 papers on exactly this type of procedure. The defense team must be nervous. Sarah, who had been quietly observing the trial herself, couldn't help but agree. Dr. Thompson's presence on the jury was proving to be far more impactful than anyone had anticipated. Her medical expertise, combined with her ability to stay composed under pressure, was creating an undeniable presence in the courtroom that no one could ignore. Back in the courtroom, the plaintiff's attorney called another expert witness to the stand, Dr. Sarah Chin, a surgical specialist from a neighboring state. Dr. Chin was giving her testimony when it became apparent that she was directing her answers specifically toward Dr. Thompson. Recognizing a fellow medical professional in the jury, Dr. Chin tailored her responses to the level of understanding and expertise she assumed Dr. Thompson would have. She spoke with precision, acknowledging the nuances of the medical procedure in ways that seemed meant to ensure that Dr. Thompson could follow the explanation with ease. Judge Harrison, who had initially been embarrassed by his quick judgments of Dr. Thompson, found himself watching her more intently than usual. Her presence had shifted significantly since the morning. What had initially felt like an embarrassing confrontation had now become a powerful reminder of the importance of diversity in the courtroom. Dr. Thompson's expertise wasn't just helping the jury understand medical facts, it was ensuring that justice would be served based on true medical understanding, rather than the muddled interpretations of less qualified individuals. During one particularly complex explanation, a young juror named Michael appeared completely lost. His furrowed brow and confused expression were clear indicators that he wasn't following the testimony. Without drawing attention to herself, Dr. Thompson quietly drew a simple diagram on her notepad, illustrating the surgical procedure that was being discussed. She passed the diagram to Michael, whose face immediately lit up with understanding. Judge Harrison, watching the interaction from his seat, noticed the small act of kindness and leadership that Dr. Thompson had exhibited. It was clear that she was not just playing a role as a juror, she was helping guide the others to a clearer understanding of the case. For a brief moment, Judge Harrison felt a wave of shame wash over him. His behavior that morning had been rash and prejudiced, a reflection of his own biases. He had nearly tried to remove Dr. Thompson from the jury, assuming that she didn't belong in the courtroom. But now, watching her in action, he realized how wrong he had been. Dr. Thompson's quiet competence was an essential asset to the trial, and her leadership in ensuring that all the jurors understood the medical testimony was invaluable. Late in the afternoon, Dr. Miller, the defendant's surgeon, was describing a critical moment during the surgery. His voice faltered slightly as he noticed Dr. Thompson leaning forward in her seat, her attention fully focused on his words. She was writing something in her notebook, and when she underlined a particular phrase twice, it seemed to draw the attention of the defense attorney, who immediately tried to redirect the testimony toward simpler terms. It was as though he sensed that Dr. Thompson's line of questioning could expose a flaw in his defense. Dr. Thompson raised her hand politely, signaling for the court's attention. Judge Harrison nodded for her to speak, and Dr. Thompson's question rang out in the courtroom with quiet authority. Your Honor, could you ask the witness to clarify the exact time sequence of events during the complications? Her question was precise, professional, and to the point, but everyone in the courtroom could sense that it carried greater significance than the simple wording suggested. Dr. Miller's face paled slightly as he realized that he would need to be more specific about his actions during those crucial moments. The timeline he then described was noticeably different from his earlier testimony, and it was clear that Dr. Thompson's expertise had led to this pivotal moment in the trial. As the afternoon session drew to a close, Judge Harrison couldn't help but reflect on how differently things might have gone if he had succeeded in removing Dr. Thompson from the jury that morning. Her presence in the courtroom wasn't just important, it was essential for justice. Without her, the medical facts might have been lost in a haze of confusion and misunderstanding. The sun was setting outside the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom, but inside, Dr. Thompson's quiet competence continued to shine. Her ability to illuminate the truth, to clarify the complexities of medical testimony, and to help others see through the fog of uncertainty, was proving invaluable. And as the trial moved forward, Judge Harrison knew that this was a moment of profound personal transformation for him as well. The second day of the trial began very differently from the first. Judge Harrison arrived at his chambers an hour earlier than usual, something he had never done before. As he sat at his desk, reviewing not just the case files but also his own past court records, he began to reflect on his conversation with Dr. Thompson the previous day. Something about that exchange had sparked a deeper self-awareness in him, a realization that he had often made quick judgments based on first impressions. How many times had his assumptions, his biases, affected the course of justice in his courtroom? How many decisions had been made without truly considering the facts? Sarah, his clerk, knocked gently on the door, bringing in his morning coffee. When she entered, she found Judge Harrison surrounded by stacks of old case files, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he looked troubled. "Your Honor," she said softly, "Dr. Thompson is already here. She's checking on Mr. Chin, the gentleman she helped yesterday. He's back for a different court case." Through his chamber window, Judge Harrison could see Dr. Thompson in the courthouse lobby. She was taking Mr. Chen's blood pressure and showing his grandson how to properly help him with his medication. Several courthouse security officers stood nearby, watching with admiration as Dr. Thompson took the time to write down clear instructions in both English and Chinese. The scene struck him hard. Here was someone who had every right to be angry about the way she had been treated the previous day, yet instead of harboring resentment, she was spending her time helping others. The contrast between her actions and his behavior from the day before couldn't have been clearer. Inside the jury room, the other jurors were beginning to treat Dr. Thompson with a new level of respect. Their interactions with her had noticeably changed. They recognized her expertise, her professionalism, and the value she brought to their discussions. The subtle shift in the jury's dynamic spoke volumes, and Judge Harrison knew that this trial would be remembered for more than just the legal facts. It would be remembered as a moment of personal growth for everyone involved, especially him. Expanded rewrite *. Dr. Michelle Thompson's role in the trial was no longer defined solely by her medical expertise, but by the dignity with which she handled the judge's prejudices. After the tense exchange between her and Judge Harrison the previous day, Dr. Thompson's calm demeanor had a profound effect on those around her. Martha, an elderly juror, approached Dr. Thompson during a break, her face filled with gratitude and admiration. "I told my husband about what happened yesterday," Martha said softly, her voice sincere. "He said we need more people like you in positions of power." Dr. Thompson smiled warmly, her demeanor as composed as ever. However, she quickly redirected the conversation back to the case. "The most important thing right now," she said, her voice steady and professional, "is ensuring we give this case the attention it deserves. Every patient deserves quality care, and every medical professional must be held accountable for their actions." Martha nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the case at hand. Dr. Thompson's unwavering focus on the trial, despite the personal challenges she faced, spoke volumes about her character. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison was having an unexpected visitor. Judge Robert Maxwell, an older, seasoned colleague, had come to deliver news that made Harrison's stomach turn. He walked into Harrison's office with a serious expression on his face. "Well, Robert," he began, "the local news has gotten wind of yesterday's incident. They're running a story about racial bias in the justice system, and they're using what happened with Dr. Thompson as their latest example." Harrison sank into his chair, the weight of the news sinking in. "They have every right to report it," he said quietly, the shame in his voice palpable. "What I did was wrong. Maybe this will help other judges examine their own biases." He stared at the papers on his desk, reflecting on the mistake he had made the day before. Judge Maxwell, usually the more pragmatic of the two, regarded him with an air of measured surprise. "That's surprisingly humble of you," he said. "What changed?" Harrison stood and walked to the window, his eyes drawn to the scene outside. He could see Dr. Thompson in the courtyard, making her way toward the courthouse. As he watched her, Harrison felt a shift in his own perspective, one that had been catalyzed by her strength and composure the day before. "Yesterday," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I saw real leadership, Bob. Not the kind that comes from a position or a title, but the kind that comes from character. Dr. Thompson could have filed a complaint. She could have demanded that I recuse myself. But instead, she showed me what true professionalism looks like." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. "She taught me a lesson that I'm not sure I'll ever forget." As the morning session began and the courtroom filled, Judge Harrison noticed something unexpected. The gallery was more crowded than usual, and as he glanced around, he realized the reason. Word had spread about Dr. Thompson's presence on the jury, and several young black law students had come to watch the trial. They sat in the back, their eyes filled with hope and determination as they observed the proceedings. As they watched Dr. Thompson take her place in the jury box, their expressions seemed to reflect the belief that someone like them could one day sit in her position, professional, composed, and respected. It was a subtle but powerful shift in the dynamic of the courtroom. Before starting the session, Judge Harrison made an unusual announcement. "Before we proceed," he began, his voice steady but firm, "I want to address something that happened yesterday." The room fell silent as everyone turned their attention to him. "Yesterday morning, I made a serious error in judgment that revealed my own biases. While I apologize privately to the person I wronged, I feel it's important to acknowledge publicly that such behavior has no place in this courtroom, or any courtroom." He paused, allowing his words to resonate. The gallery remained silent, but several people in the room nodded approvingly, their expressions reflecting the gravity of his statement. Dr. Thompson's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes briefly met Judge Harrison's, and in that brief exchange, he understood the significance of his public apology. Her acknowledgement wasn't one of confrontation but of understanding. The moment felt like a quiet victory, not for Judge Harrison, but for the principles of justice and fairness that he was now striving to uphold. As the trial resumed, Harrison found himself running his courtroom differently. He was more attentive, listening more carefully to the testimony and speaking more thoughtfully. Most importantly, he became acutely aware of his own internal biases. Every time he felt a snap judgment forming in his mind, he caught himself. The lesson Dr. Thompson had taught him, through her composure, her professionalism, and her quiet strength, was already changing how he approached his sacred duty to justice. He found himself becoming more deliberate, more introspective, and more mindful of the weight of his decisions. The medical malpractice trial was reaching its final stages on the third day, and the tension in courtroom 7 was palpable. Both legal teams were preparing for their closing arguments, but despite the high stakes, all eyes were on Dr. Michelle Thompson. Her presence on the jury had been a constant throughout the trial, and she had proven to be an invaluable asset in guiding her fellow jurors through the complexities of the medical testimony. Now, with the trial coming to a close, Dr. Thompson continued to lead with quiet authority, her every action speaking volumes about her character and her commitment to justice. During the defense's final presentation, an unexpected moment changed everything. The defense attorney, trying to prove that Dr. Miller's actions during the surgery were within the bounds of standard practice, showed slides of the procedure. He pointed to various steps, attempting to make his case that the defendant had acted appropriately. But as the attorney spoke, Dr. Thompson suddenly raised her hand, a rare gesture for someone who preferred to speak only when absolutely necessary. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, "I believe there's a significant discrepancy in the surgical timestamps being shown." The entire courtroom fell silent. The defense attorney stopped mid-sentence, and Dr. Miller, the defendant's surgeon, turned visibly pale. Dr. Thompson's voice cut through the tension as she continued. "The medical records show the patient's blood pressure dropped at 9:45 a.m., but the surgical log shows that the emergency response didn't begin until 10:30 a.m. That's a 45-minute gap that hasn't been explained." The defense attorney fumbled with his papers, trying to gather his thoughts, while Dr. Miller, who had been so confident throughout the trial, looked shaken. This small but significant detail had somehow been overlooked by both legal teams. However, it hadn't escaped Dr. Thompson's trained eye. As she spoke, Mrs. Garcia, the plaintiff, who had been silently watching the proceedings, began to cry softly. Her husband squeezed her hand tightly, both of them realizing that this observation might be the key to their case. Judge Harrison, who had spent much of the trial grappling with his own biases and assumptions, watched as Dr. Thompson's simple but incisive observation unraveled the defense's carefully constructed timeline. He couldn't help but reflect on how his initial prejudice could have prevented this moment of truth from emerging. The significance of what had just transpired was not lost on him. Dr. Thompson had shown the courtroom that true professionalism wasn't about maintaining a facade of competence, but about seeking the truth, no matter the consequences. When it came time for the jury to deliberate, Dr. Thompson's medical expertise proved invaluable once again. In the jury room, she carefully explained the significance of the 45-minute gap to her fellow jurors. In a surgery like this, she said, using simple terms that everyone could understand, every minute counts. A 45-minute delay in responding to a dropping blood pressure isn't just concerning, it's potentially negligent. Martha, the elderly juror, spoke up. But Dr. Miller seemed so confident when he explained his actions. Dr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully. Confidence doesn't always equal competence. As medical professionals, our first duty is to our patients' safety, not to protecting our egos. Her words resonated with the jury, and after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury finally reached its decision. As the jurors filed back into the courtroom, Judge Harrison noticed something important. The other jurors had naturally formed a protective circle around Dr. Thompson, understanding the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. The courtroom was packed as news of Dr. Thompson's crucial observation had spread, drawing local doctors and medical students to witness the verdict. Among them sat Mr. Chin, the elderly man whose life Dr. Thompson had saved just 2 days ago. He sat in the back, his face filled with pride and gratitude. Standing tall, Dr. Thompson prepared to deliver the verdict. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she spoke. In the case of Garcia versus Dr. Miller, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of medical negligence. Then, in an unexpected move, she did something that left the courtroom stunned. Instead of reading the usual closing statement, Dr. Thompson paused for a moment and looked at the defendant, her expression serious but composed. The moment was not just a legal decision. It was a moment of profound personal growth and collective justice. Expanded rewrite asterisk. Dr. Michelle Thompson had been a pivotal force in the courtroom, and her role was far from over. As the trial came to an end, and the jury delivered their verdict, she did not simply sit down after reading the decision. Instead, with permission granted by Judge Harrison, she stood once more to explain the jury's reasoning, providing clarity on the careful thought process that had led them to their conclusion. Our decision was not reached lightly, she began, her voice strong and steady, yet filled with a quiet authority that captured the room's attention. We considered all evidence carefully. The 45-minute delay in responding to the patient's dropping blood pressure represents a serious deviation from standard medical care. Dr. Thompson's words carried the weight of someone who understood not only the science of medicine but the moral responsibility that came with it. As medical professionals, we have a sacred duty to our patients. When we fail in that duty, we must be held accountable. She paused, allowing her words to resonate throughout the courtroom. The gravity of her statement was undeniable. Judge Harrison watched as Dr. Miller, the defendant's surgeon, bowed his head, his body language clearly acknowledging the truth of Dr. Thompson's words. His confidence had faltered in the face of the facts, and now it was clear that the case against him was irrefutable. In the gallery, the plaintiff's family, who had been sitting tensely throughout the trial, finally embraced one another. Tears of relief flowed freely as they realized that justice had been served, not just for them, but for the larger principle of patient safety that Dr. Thompson had so fiercely advocated for. What happened next was something that left even the most seasoned courthouse observers in awe. The medical students, who had been quietly watching the proceedings from the gallery, stood up in unison. Their rise wasn't just in recognition of the verdict, it was a silent tribute to Dr. Thompson herself, to her unwavering dedication, her professionalism, and her embodiment of both medical and moral integrity. They were showing respect not only for the decision but for the way in which Dr. Thompson had demonstrated what true leadership looked like in a professional setting. The courthouse reporter, who had covered hundreds of trials over the years, later reflected that she had never witnessed a verdict delivered with such precision, compassion, and authority. The event had transcended its legal proceedings and had become something more profound, a powerful lesson in human decency and the pursuit of justice. As the verdict was recorded and the courtroom began to empty, Judge Harrison looked at Dr. Thompson with a newfound respect. In just 3 days she had not only ensured that justice was served, but she had also taught everyone in the room powerful lessons about prejudice, professionalism, and the true meaning of justice. Her actions had created a ripple effect that would leave an indelible mark on the courthouse and the people within it. As the sun set on that third day, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, Dr. Thompson gathered her notes one final time. Her role as jury foreperson was complete, but the impact she had made on Courtroom 7 would last far beyond this particular case. Her quiet strength and determination had altered the course of the trial and left a lasting imprint on everyone involved. A month later, the Franklin County Courthouse looked different, visibly and symbolically. New signs had been placed in every courtroom with the bold words, "Justice sees no color, only truth." These weren't just empty words to be glossed over or ignored. They were the direct result of changes Judge William Harrison had implemented following his encounter with Dr. Michelle Thompson. The impact of her presence in that courtroom had sparked a series of transformations within the judicial system, all aimed at making the courthouse a more equitable and just place for all. On that particular morning, the courthouse was unusually busy. The local bar association was holding its annual meeting in the main conference room, and Judge Harrison had been asked to speak. He stood at the podium facing a packed room of lawyers, judges, and legal professionals. As he adjusted the microphone, his hands trembled slightly. "A month ago, I made a mistake that changed my entire perspective on justice," he began, his voice carrying the weight of reflection. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I almost prevented a highly qualified medical professional from serving as jury forewoman, all because of the color of her skin." In the audience, Dr. Thompson sat quietly, her presence commanding yet unassuming. She hadn't planned to attend the event, but Judge Harrison had personally called her and invited her to be present. She wore the same navy blue suit that she had worn on that first day in the courthouse, but this time there was no rush, no emergency CPR to perform. She sat back in her chair, listening intently as the judge continued. "Since that day," Judge Harrison explained, his tone now one of humility, "we've made changes in our courthouse." He paused for a moment to let the significance of his words sink in. "We've instituted mandatory bias training for all court personnel. We've revised our jury selection procedures to ensure a more inclusive process. We've created a new position, Community Justice Advisor, and I'm proud to announce that Dr. Michelle Thompson has agreed to serve as our first advisor." The room erupted in applause. The young law students who had witnessed the trial, many of whom were now interns at the courthouse, clapped the loudest. They had already heard about Dr. Thompson's new role. She was now officially a part of the system she had once been an outsider to, and her presence in this capacity would ensure that the justice system better served all members of the community. Mr. Chin, the elderly man whose life Dr. Thompson had saved just days before the trial, sat in the front row with his grandson. He had become a regular volunteer at the courthouse, assisting as a translator for other Chinese-speaking residents. His presence was a daily reminder of how one person's integrity could spark a ripple effect of positive change. Judge Harrison then shared something unexpected. "Last week," he continued, "I reversed 3 of my previous judgments after reviewing them for potential bias. It wasn't easy to admit I might have been wrong, but Dr. Thompson taught me that true justice requires constant self-examination. It requires humility." The room fell silent for a moment as the truth of his words resonated deeply. Even in the highest positions of power, the capacity to reflect, learn, and grow was essential to the pursuit of justice. In the back of the room, Sarah, the court clerk, wiped away a tear. She remembered the first morning when she had been terrified to tell Judge Harrison he was wrong, but now she ran the courthouse's new cultural sensitivity training program. Sarah had also undergone a transformation, and now she was part of the change that had been set in motion by Dr. Thompson's presence. After the speech, Dr. Thompson approached Judge Harrison. She carried a small package in her hands, which she presented to him with a warm smile. "Your Honor," she said, "the medical board asked me to give you this." Inside the package was a plaque recognizing the courthouse's new initiatives for promoting equality in the justice system. Judge Harrison looked at the plaque, his voice quiet as he spoke. "I don't deserve this," he said. "This isn't about what I did wrong." Dr. Thompson replied gently, "It's about what you did to make it right." Her words were simple but profound, and they reflected the essence of what true justice meant: an ongoing commitment to learn, grow, and correct past mistakes. Later that afternoon, a young black girl who was on a school field trip stopped Dr. Thompson in the hallway. "Are you the doctor who became a jury leader?" the girl asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "My mom told me about you. I want to be a doctor and a judge." Dr. Thompson knelt down to the girl's level, her smile warm and encouraging. "You can be anything you want to be," she said, "and don't let anyone's assumptions stop you." Judge Harrison, watching from his chamber window, smiled as he saw Dr. Thompson interact with the young girl. It was a moment of generational impact, a moment that showed how deeply the ripples of Dr. Thompson's influence would spread, touching not only the present but also the future. The courthouse had handled over 100 cases since the medical malpractice trial, and each one had been approached with a new level of consciousness and care. As the day came to a close, Dr. Thompson checked in on the new bias training session for incoming court officers. She passed by courtroom 7A, which had now become known informally as the Thompson Court. Inside, a diverse group of jurors was being sworn in for a new trial. As Dr. Thompson passed by, Judge Harrison caught up with her in the lobby. "Dr. Thompson," he called out, "I never asked. Why did you accept the advisor position?" Dr. Thompson turned to him with a warm smile. "Because change doesn't happen from the outside, Your Honor. It happens when people on the inside decide to be better." Together, they walked out of the courthouse, the setting sun casting their shadows side by side on the steps. A judge and a doctor, so different yet united in their commitment to justice. Above them, the courthouse's new motto gleamed. Justice sees no color, only truth. In that moment, both knew that what had started as a morning of prejudice had transformed into a legacy of positive change, one that would impact the community for generations to come.